Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook, and with me is Dr. Emilio Iodice. He has spent more than 3 decades as a senior executive in public and private sectors. He was a key official in Washington and worked for several administrations. He remains among the most decorated Foreign Service officers in American history, with a gold medal for heroism, a gold medal and silver medal for exemplary service, nominations for the Bronze Medal, and numerous commendations and citations. He served as a minister in key U.S. missions abroad, including Brazil, Mexico City, Rome, Madrid, and Paris, and departed after being named to a list of future ambassadors. His honors include being knighted by the former King of Italy and receiving medals of honor from Spain and Italy. He was also vice president of Lucent Technologies, which is no small operation, operating in markets in the globe across the world. He speaks several languages and has traveled throughout the globe. He's the author of Profiles in Leadership from Caesar to Modern Times, Reflections, Stories of Power, Love, Inspiration, and Remembrance, Sisters, the story of 2 extraordinary women, his mother and his aunt, and a best-selling biography of the tenor Mario Lanza, a kid from Philadelphia, Mario Lanza, the voice of poets. But the book we're going to talk about today is extremely relevant to 2016, and it's about selecting the president. The book is called 2016, Selecting the President, the Most Important Decision We Make in Our Lifetime, and I tend to agree. Dr. Iodice, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, John. I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you.
This reads like someone who was a presidential scholar. You obviously have a great deal of knowledge of the history of our presidents and use them as examples of the qualities of good leadership, and I really appreciate that.
Thank you very much, John. Yes, I did. I am a presidential scholar in the sense that I've studied as many administrations as I can. I've also worked for a number of them, and I came close, of course, to the Oval Office so many times. So I really do have a feel for it, and also for the balance of power in our government and how our government works and how the presidency works today and what kind of qualities we need in the president in this particular time in our history.
You write early on in the introduction that this is the president for this time is selecting the president for the United States is a matter of life and death, success and failure, peace and war, poverty and prosperity. That's some pretty serious stuff.
It is, because the president is the only planetary leader, John. Really, this is the only office, the only leader that the decisions are so vital and important, they can affect the whole globe, and they can affect the future of humanity. So when we talk about the President of the United States, we're not just talking about any leader of any country. We're talking about truly the only global leader and the leader of a country that has interests across the board and has so much military power, economic power, and even moral power that they can influence the future of events permanently, and of course the lives of millions, maybe billions of people.
You know, it's interesting. I have friends from other nations. In fact, my girlfriend lives in Mexico, and when I talk about the President of the United States being the leader of the free world, they kind of sniff a little bit and are a little concerned that he's given so much credit. But when you talk about being the chief executive, administrator, and diplomat, and commander-in-chief, and even the chief legislator and chief of the party, it does look an awful lot like their influence is global and does affect every other nation.
Absolutely. And our history shows this, and that's what I show in the book, that historically the presidents of the United States really have affected the course of history in so many different occasions. And the United States keeps growing in power and keeps growing in influence, even in this particular period where everything seems to be chaotic, out of control in so many different areas. Once the United States decides to make a decision and go in a certain direction, it can coalesce countries around it, allies, and can actually determine the future. So this is why it's so important, and I want people to understand that the president really does affect the life of the people across the planet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You mentioned the impact of social media in our time, as well as the importance of recognizing when we elect a government. We elect a president, we elect a government. But I'd like to start about talking about what to look for. You give examples of my favorites, TR and FDR and Lincoln in particular seems to be in every category of the qualities of a great president. What are the most important things that we need to look for in 2016?
At this particular time in our history, and in this particular time in this century, with the great domestic and international problems we face, first of all, we need a reformer. We need somebody who can come in and reform the system. We know the problems. We've been talking about them continuously, whether it's campaign financing, whether it's reform of any one of our social policies or of our economy. All these things require a reformer and someone who will bring in people that are willing, able, and capable of helping that president reform the system. So that's number one. Number two is character. Character, and this is complex, but this means trustworthiness, integrity. Sometimes we take this for granted, but character is so fundamentally important. Teddy Roosevelt had that. Lincoln had that. George Washington had that. But it's absolutely essential. And then third is emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence really is that capacity of equilibrium in a leader. Someone who's not impulsive, someone who is mentally stable. So that's key as well. That's one of the things we often don't think about, but emotional intelligence is that particular quality that really is at the heart of decision making. Mm-hmm. And then fourth, I would say, is the ability to communicate at all levels and communicate a vision. Mm-hmm. And of course, I'm taking for granted that the person who's presenting themselves to us as a presidential candidate already has relevant experience to do the job. There are 15 categories, 15 qualities that I outline in the book. Lincoln had many of them, almost all of them. Very few of our presidents have had all of them. But today, we really do need somebody who's a luminary, someone who can really tackle the great issues that are affecting, again, the United States and the whole globe.
Mm-hmm. I think in my own lifetime of great communicators, Reagan and Clinton in particular, but one of the issues you bring up early, and I think it is important, is that George H.W. Bush's famous "read my lips, no new taxes," but then had to relent because of the budget deficit. Sometimes you have to reverse your field based on circumstances, right?
Absolutely. You have to change your mind when new facts are presented to you. And the ability of a president to make decisions based on facts is really key. George Bush was presented with serious facts, and he had to make a decision. But that decision may have cost him the presidency. Mm-hmm. The thing with Gerald Ford, and we use that example in the book.
The pardon.
Yeah. The Nixon pardon. Ford could have done it in a different way, perhaps, or gone in a different direction, but he was interested in what would happen to the country if they had to try the former president of the United States, for several years, when they had the Vietnam War still raging and they had the economy was tanking. There were so many big problems facing Gerald Ford. He didn't want this hanging over him, so he was presented with the facts, and he made a decision.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit about some of those categories, but if I skip to the end, I notice you have a checklist where we can put the candidates and what of the qualities you think are important they each have. And I'm concerned. You've done a good job of being objective in this book about pointing to strengths and weaknesses without being political, but especially the Republican debates have made me dubious as to whether any of them are qualified. One of the things you say early on is that we need to look cautiously at those candidates who speak without self-control and play loose and fast with the facts. If there's not anybody that looks good to us, what are we supposed to do?
It's tragic that where we will be or may be at a situation where we have to select the least of the evils in this particular case. We've had that before in presidential elections. We've had to make choices that we didn't necessarily feel were the best ones. Fortunately, we've survived all of that. This particular election is going to be truly historic. Of course, we know what's happening on the Republican side, and we know that Donald Trump, as of perhaps next week, may be, for all practical purposes, the nominee of the party.
Right, yeah.
And he has been measured on a completely different scale versus the politicians. It seems like no matter what is presented to the voters in these primaries about his past, about some of the things that he said and continues to say, he's still judged completely differently than a Rubio or a Cruz or any of the other candidates. So this is really a very, very strange election for us. On the Republican side, we may be seeing the meltdown of the grand old party.
Yeah, it does appear that way from, and the pundits are saying that sort of thing. It's hard to know what is accurate versus what the interpretation provides. But if we look at some of the serious issues, and the one of the biggest for me is the reforming campaign financing. We really have these dark money PACs that have deep pockets and are pouring a lot of money into the campaign, and to the credit of the American voter, it doesn't always affect their decision. If you think about the millions and millions that have been spent on both Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio, they don't seem to be getting traction from all of that, but there's still all this money in there, and something needs to be done.
Absolutely, and anyone that says that a politician is not influenced by this, well, we're being either naive or disingenuous. This really isn't the case. No one invests millions and millions in a candidate's campaign without ultimately expecting some kind of IOU down the line. So this is the kind of thing that we have to change. Teddy Roosevelt worked very hard to change not only the civil service system, but also the way campaigns are financed and the lobbying system. And we've made some progress over the years, but the really big stuff still has not been done. And unless we do that, we will be damaging our democracy. This is all about democracy, John. This is about freedom. This is about the right choices and allowing people to emerge as well on the scene, politicians that really would like to get involved in the political process, or even people from the private sector, people like yourself, but you have to risk your life, your sacred fortunes, and then you have to go out and ask money from people that you don't know or people that you may be beholden to, and that'll affect your judgment in the future.
Let's say a bit more about Teddy Roosevelt, because your first category for a leadership quality president must have is reformer, and I can think of no greater reformer in history than TR and all he did, even when he was in commerce and labor. But the Pure Food and Drug Act, the getting money out of politics, the trust busting. I mean, this guy was like the classic example of the reformer.
Absolutely. I, as a leader, once received a tremendous compliment. They said, Emilio can't be frightened, he can't be bought, and he can't be fooled. Well,
that's great.
It's the exact same thing about Teddy Roosevelt, and that was his strength. He was courageous, he was smart, he wasn't afraid of anything, he knew exactly what had to be done, and once he saw something was wrong, he took action. And he knew that he had to be a reformer. He knew what was going on in the country. Well, here's a man who brings together Russia and Japanese, Russians and the Japanese, and helps end the Russo-Japanese War and wins the Nobel Peace Prize. This is the only president that's won the Medal of Honor. So Teddy Roosevelt was truly unique. We need him today.
We do, and don't want to leave out the Panama Canal and the West Wing among the things he built, because his list goes on and on. I really appreciate the Food and Drug Administration, although it needs some revamping right now. But even some of the things he did got major reversals from Supreme Court decisions lately.
But he didn't give up.
Right.
And the same thing with Franklin Roosevelt. Even though when the New Deal was struck down by the Supreme Court, he didn't give up. He sponsored new legislation, things that could be accepted. So that's important. In the checks and balances, this is part of the process. Presidents are aware of it, but they have to go back. They have to be persistent. Persistence, determination is the key in all of this.
Mm-hmm. And one more thing about Reformation, because we have to mention Abe Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation, because that was an extraordinary thing at an extraordinary time that I don't even know how it got through.
Well, that was because of Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
And felt this was a priority. His cabinet felt that it wasn't the right time. It was something that couldn't be done. They saw all different types of problems with it. Lincoln was the only one that, first of all, thought that it was not impossible, and second, felt that it was absolutely essential at that particular time to have the Emancipation Proclamation. He said, this will be the basis of everything else that we do in the future. This will set the course of humanity. And a point that Lincoln made way back then, he said, the world is watching us. The world is watching us. John, I'm in Rome, Italy, and I promise you that the world is watching our election. They watch everything that America does.
Yes.
It's out in the press. It comes out in comments by leaders all the time. So the world is watching us today, just like they watched us during Abe Lincoln's time.
Mm-hmm. You know, one of the things you talk about is experience, and gubernatorial experience is important because 17 of our presidents were state governors before they were president. And yet, sometimes experience doesn't teach. James Buchanan, one of the most experienced presidents, might be one of our worst leaders of all time.
That's right. I write about him, where he had all types of experience that you could think of. And if you look at his resume, you'd say, this is the man we want in the White House. Well, it was a mistake because he had experience, but it wasn't what we call relevant experience. That is the kind of experience that tempers a leader, that creates a leader to deal with big problems in a special way. What is the special way? Well, most leaders don't know the solutions, but they know the right questions to ask. And that's what I've seen with leaders at the presidential level. They come in and they say, look, I don't know all the solutions to the problems, but I do know what questions to ask. James Buchanan didn't have that ability, and secondly, he was afraid to make decisions. And at the end, he left the country bankrupt, and he also left the great problems to Abraham Lincoln to solve, especially the problems of slavery. If Buchanan had been a different president, we may not have had the Civil War.
That says it all right there. Well, let's look at great communicators, because this is something that really matters to me as a communication professor. And, of course, FDR comes to mind, and Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton. But Abraham Lincoln seemed to have an economy of language that was powerful and to the point and succinct. And he didn't have a grand education. He educated himself.
He did. He only had a couple of years of formal education, probably third grade, fourth grade at the most. But once he learned how to read, everything changed for Lincoln. The whole world opened up to him. He devoured books. He devoured the classics. He could recite Shakespeare. And it tempered his mind. It created this brilliant mind that Lincoln had. And it also, of course, affected the way he was able to communicate. Lincoln weighed his words. Every single word mattered, and he knew that he was talking for history. His speeches were short. They weren't very long, but he knew that what he was saying was being captured by the future, by being captured by us today. He didn't have a good vocal presence. He had a very high-pitched voice. He wasn't a baritone like FDR, no, but he was able to express himself in a way that was strong, it was emotional, it was powerful, and everyone could understand it, no matter what stage they were in, whether they were the rich, the middle class, or the poor. Everyone understood Abraham Lincoln's words.
Mm-hmm. And we might as well mention FDR in the fireside chats and how he connected with people so well, because that was such a beautiful thing at a time when we really needed it most.
He was a man who understood technology quickly. He understood the new medium, and he latched onto it right away. And his voice, which was perfect for radio and perfect for any kind of speech making, was the kind of voice that you want to listen to. And FDR knew this. He knew that he could transmit the right kind of message to the people. He knew what they wanted, what they needed. I end the book with a story about him that I think is so vital, because I mentioned that the ability to convey trust and to get trust from the people. When Roosevelt died in 1945, a reporter saw a young sailor.
Oh yes, I remember this.
At the gates of the White House, crying as the coffin of FDR passed by, and the reporter asked this young man, said, "Son, did you know the president?" And this crying young man who had just come from the Pacific Theater said, "Sir, I didn't know Roosevelt, but Roosevelt knew me." And that's the difference.
You know, that consubstantiation, that identification factor is so powerful. And you quote Reagan as saying, "I wasn't a great communicator, but I communicated great things, and they didn't spring full bloom from my brow. They came from the heart of a great nation." And that really defines why he was a great communicator, I think.
He was a wonderful communicator. His letters to the people of America are beautiful. And Reagan knew how to say the right thing at the right moment. And he also used stories, just like Abraham Lincoln. He also used humor. He also used self-deprecation all the time. Mm-hmm. And this humility that Ronald Reagan had helped him govern, just like it helped Lincoln as well. Humility is very, very important in the White House.
Mm-hmm. And I didn't often think fondly of some of his policies, but with the passing of Nancy Reagan this week, you got how much she adored him and what a kind heart he must have had, which is not something you look for when you're looking at a president not of your party.
Well, I had the opportunity to be in the Reagan White House, and Ronald Reagan was a man of compassion, and he was a man of substance. He had been governor of California for 8 years. People often forget that. They think he went from the silver screen into the White House. But he had experience, and he had principles. But yet Reagan basically said, look, we ask for 100%. If we get 50, then we declare victory. Mm-hmm. The art of compromise was also one of the qualities that Reagan had.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about a challenging one, because many presidents created their brain trust, their cabinet, and their advisors, some of whom disagreed with them or were contentious with them, but they thought that needed to happen. FDR's brain trust was incredible. Lincoln wasn't afraid to appoint people who were opposed to him. What does it take to make a great set of advisors so a president has a good brain trust to rely on?
First of all, the president has to know himself, has to know the weaknesses that he has within his own leadership abilities. As we said, very few presidents have all 15 of the qualities. But let's take foreign policy, for instance. We want to make sure that whoever the president is, that they pick somebody who has good, strong foreign policy experience as their principal advisor. Well, they have to also have confidence in themselves that even though they don't understand everything about foreign policy, they'll be able to ask the right questions, they'll be able to make the right choices, and they'll be also good students, because part of the presidency is studying, examining, reflecting, and understanding the facts. And that's why you have to have somebody who comes in who has enough self-confidence, but enough humility to pick people that may be better than he or she in certain areas.
Mm-hmm. What do you see as the major contribution of Ike? Because there were a number of places where you cited him, and it'll be hard to get to all of it with the 5 minutes we have left. So tell me what you think was Ike's greatest quality that made a contribution to the growth of America.
I think his determination to constantly make decisions, again, based on facts, by organizing the government in a way that it was administered properly with the National Security Council, with the way he developed from the bottom up information. He wanted to know what were the great things that America needed, for instance, infrastructure. Well, they needed a highway system, the interstate highway system. They needed to link the Great Lakes, the St. Lawrence Seaway, and so forth. The things that Ike stressed were domestic, number one, domestic stability and the domestic economy, proper functioning of government, balancing the budget, living within our means. He left the White House with a balanced budget, and he left also with 8 years without wars. And Ike understood this. He also understood where the world was at that time and how to manage things in a way where each and every country that he was dealing with, especially our allies, were involved in the process of decision-making, or at least felt that they were. Yeah. But the U.S. always exercised responsibility under Eisenhower. I think he's a president worth examining more.
Yeah, I think his experience as a general was real important as the Cold War began to emerge as a global issue. I want to talk about emotional intelligence for a minute, because when I first read the book, I accidentally skipped pages 174 and 75 and said, he doesn't define it. But then I went back and said, oh, here it is. The 5 components are self-awareness, self-regulation, internal motivation, empathy, and social skills. And there are certain presidents that have that, but probably Lincoln is the one that stands out the most.
Absolutely. Lincoln had this because he demonstrated it constantly. He had huge problems from a personal point of view. We often forget that his sons died in his arms, one of whom died in the White House. He had a wife that didn't make things easy for him. And Lincoln had to deal with all types of personalities. So these qualities Lincoln had more than any other president because he was challenged more, and he had to also face the Civil War. So Lincoln had huge personal challenges, huge political challenges, huge challenges also in his cabinet, and still he persevered and went forward and won the war and created a new nation for us.
Mm-hmm. We haven't talked at all about JFK or Lyndon, and together they did a lot of reforming, so maybe we should mention their contribution in that regard, how they changed the nation for the better.
I think John Kennedy, it's unfortunate, of course, that he was there only for 2 years, but John Kennedy demonstrated courage, and I think it was that courage to do the right thing, even if it wasn't the right time, was very, very important. And that courage, that determination, carried over into LBJ, who, after he won resoundingly in 1964, had the mandate to make the courage of John Kennedy bear fruit. Mm-hmm. And that's what basically he did. And yes, they were two great reformers, and I think that Lyndon Johnson should be judged also on the domestic things that he did, not just the war in Vietnam.
And because so often we remember the war in Vietnam, which was an experience that was difficult for many Americans because of the divisiveness. I'm about out of time, but I want to make sure that the readers know that this is a book worth reading, especially now in this election year. The candidates' qualities that we should be looking for are someone who's a reformer, who has experience, who's a great communicator, who can build a great brain trust, who has character and vision and emotional intelligence and courage and wisdom, can be a good decision maker, yet has humility, is passionate and energetic, flexible, loves learning, respects diversity, and can engage the trust of others. And that's the things we'll be looking for as we choose our next president in a most important presidential race. We've been talking with Emilio Iodice, the author of 2016, Selecting the President. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. I want to remind you that if you don't catch our program on 88 FM the 4 times each week that it airs, you can also find us on YouTube and Facebook under Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook. Thanks for listening.